It was a chilly Thursday afternoon, the kind where the cold air bites at your cheeks and makes you tighten your scarf just a little more. I stepped into the bank, grateful for the warmth that greeted me. The faint hum of conversations, the rhythmic clicking of keyboards, and the occasional ding of a service bell filled the air. I clutched my purse tightly in one hand and the small check in the other, double-checking the deposit slip I had neatly filled out earlier. It wasn't my first time at this branch. I'd been banking here for years, but for some reason, I always felt a little out of place. The space was modern and polished, with shiny tiled floors and spotless glass partitions. Everything about it seemed to demand perfection, from the suited staff to the pristine counters. Still, I wasn't there to linger or admire the decor. I was there for a simple transaction. The line was longer than usual, winding past the ropes that separated us from the tellers. People shuffled impatiently, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. No one made eye contact, and I felt a familiar sense of invisibility creep in. I straightened my back, reminding myself that I had every right to be there. As I waited, I glanced around the room. A mother was trying to calm her restless toddler, who kept tugging at her coat. An older man fumbled with some papers at the self-service kiosk. Everyone seemed busy with their own lives, and yet, for some reason, I felt the weight of an unspoken expectation, like I needed to justify my presence. Finally, it was my turn. I stepped forward, the sound of my heels clicking lightly against the floor. The teller was a young man, probably in his late 20s. His tie was perfectly knotted, and his hair was slicked back so neatly it looked like it hadn't moved all day. "Hi, good afternoon," I said with a polite smile, sliding the check and my ID across the counter. He barely glanced at me, his eyes immediately fixating on the check. He picked it up and held it to the light, tilting it back and forth as though inspecting it for hidden secrets. "This doesn't seem right," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I froze for a moment, caught off guard by his words. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice calm but laced with confusion. The corners of his mouth twitched into a faint smirk, one that sent a wave of unease through me. "Where did you get this check, ma'am?" he asked, his tone sharp and skeptical. I tilted my head, feeling the weight of his question sink in. "I'm sorry?" I asked, my tone polite but firm. He didn't look up. Instead, he set the check down on the counter, as though it had suddenly become something tainted. "Where did you get this check, ma'am?" he repeated, his voice dripping with a judgment that left me unsettled. My hands tightened around my purse. "It's payment for some consulting work I did," I explained, trying to sound casual, though my stomach was tightening with each passing second. He blinked slowly, like my answer didn't fit the mold he had in mind. His eyes narrowed as he began typing on his keyboard with exaggerated slowness. "Consulting work," he repeated under his breath, his tone suggesting that those words didn't belong to someone like me. "We get a lot of unusual checks here, just trying to make sure it's legitimate." My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel my chest tightening. "Are you suggesting it's not legitimate?" I asked, my voice rising just a bit, though I tried to keep my composure. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another look at my ID and the check, tapping on his keyboard once more. "I'm going to need to verify this," he said, standing abruptly, his face a mask of indifference as he walked away with my documents. I stood there, rooted to the spot as the world seemed to slow down around me. The quiet murmur of conversations continued, but my focus was on the heavy silence that had fallen over me. I could feel the weight of the other customers' eyes on me. Some glanced quickly, their eyes darting away before I could catch them. Others stared openly, their gazes lingering with an almost clinical curiosity. I couldn't tell if they were intrigued or uncomfortable, or maybe they were just as confused by the scene unfolding in front of them as I was. My chest felt tight, my pulse quickening. I had been in situations like this before, where people doubted my abilities, my status, my place in the world, simply because of how I looked. It wasn't new, but it still stung every time. I had been through too many instances of being questioned, judged, and disregarded to let it slide. But even with the familiar sting, the humiliation of it burned deep. I swallowed hard, forcing my breath to steady. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to back down. A few minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity. The teller finally returned, holding my check and ID in both hands, looking as though he had been holding something toxic. "I'm going to need to escalate this to my manager," he said, his voice avoiding my gaze as he spoke, clearly trying to avoid confrontation. "Escalate it?" I repeated, my voice now firmer, more certain. "Why? It's a straightforward transaction." He hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the counter. "It's just protocol, ma'am," he said, his words trailing off as though he wasn't entirely sure of them himself. I folded my arms and leaned forward, my voice steady but cutting. "Protocol? Or are you assuming I don't belong here?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. He faltered, his face turning slightly pale. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. No, that's not what I meant. Because it feels like that's exactly what you're implying," I interrupted, my voice shaking, not with fear, but with the kind of anger that comes when someone assumes you don't belong. "I've been a customer of this bank for years, and I've never been treated like this." Before he could respond, the door to the back office swung open, and a woman in a crisp navy blazer approached. She looked between the two of us, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she took in the tension in the air. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice even but firm. "Yes," I said, my tone unflinching. "I'm trying to deposit a check, and your employee here is treating me like a criminal." The manager's gaze snapped to the teller, who was now visibly pale, standing there like he had seen a ghost. "Can I see the check?" she asked, her tone a sharp contrast to the teller's earlier skepticism. He handed it over, along with my ID, and the manager took a moment to inspect both carefully. I could feel my pulse racing as I watched her study the documents. After a moment, she looked up at me, her expression softening. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience. This check is perfectly valid. We'll process it right away." I nodded, trying to maintain control of my emotions, though my hands were clenched tightly at my sides, but I wasn't finished yet. "I'd like to know why he assumed it wasn't valid in the first place," I said, gesturing toward the teller, who looked as though he wanted to sink into the floor and disappear. The manager's face flushed slightly. She looked over at the teller, her gaze cold and stern. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. We'll address this internally." I took a deep breath, my voice firm as I reached into my bag. "You know," I said, pulling out a small folder from my purse, "I happen to own shares in this bank. So technically, I'm not just a customer, I'm a shareholder, and I take customer service very seriously." The teller's face went completely pale. His eyes widened and he visibly shrank back. It was as though the ground had opened up beneath him,